In the first line of the very first part of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and his collaborator Engels are telling us that all human history up to this point in time, the time that they're writing, has been what they call the history of class struggle. So their idea is that we have classes, basic organizations of human beings according to their role, according to their place in society, and that these classes in every society up to this point have been in a kind of situation, whether they realized it or not, of antagonism, of competition and conflict with each other. Oftentimes this could be covered over by institutions of law, notions of property, the ongoing processes of production. You could supply distractions by focusing on wars and political developments between states, between organizations, between peoples. But what's really been happening, according to Marx, is the interplay between all of these classes and the rise of certain ones to dominance and the fall of other ones from previous situations or conditions of being on top. So we're going to chart the movement from ancient or feudal society, and I'm actually, oversimplifying here a little bit, admittedly, because Marx and Engel will distinguish between ancient and feudal society, but I want to keep it pretty simple for this. And the transformation of that society over generations into modern bourgeois society, the society that we can identify with the industrial age and its conditions. So what Marx and Engels are doing in this first part is telling a story. Now they're making a lot of really important side remarks along the way that I'm going to point out for you, but we want to pay attention to the grand narrative of what's going on. And if you want to sum it up in just one single line, it's that the people who are on top come to be replaced by a new class of people, the bourgeoisie. And it's kind of maybe a little bit misleading for me to draw this arrow as if the nobility or the aristocracy simply became the bourgeoisie. That did happen in some cases historically, but as a class, they really didn't become that. Instead, the bourgeoisie are coming from some of these lower classes originally that have less freedom, that have less control over their own destiny, and they're going to become the ones to dominate what's happening in industrial society. So let's look at what Marx and Engels have to say first about ancient and feudal society. He says, free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on a uninterrupted, now hidden, now an open fight, a fight that each time ended in some sort of change, either a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. You can't avoid the conflict that economic life is going to bring about. And now notice he says that in ancient society and in feudal society, we find a complicated arrangement of society into various orders and manifold gradation of social rank. And so he gives the example of ancient Rome, where you had the patrician class at the bottom, you had the plebeians, actually below them you had the ones that were just called proletariats, and we'll talk about what that means. But then you had a whole bunch of other people in between. And the same thing happens in medieval society as well. It's not so simple as just those who have power and those who don't have power, those who are at the bottom. There's an entire grade or ordering or hierarchy of ranks. And sometimes it's not so simple as just a bunch of strata. Sometimes there can be lateral relations as well. But I don't want to, again, overcomplicate things too much. So what they're saying is that in modern bourgeois society, they didn't do away with class antagonism. Like he says, it has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Now, it hasn't actually done just that. It's taken a lot of these classes that existed in previous society and imported them into this, but the bourgeoisie end up being on top. So he says, our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses this distinct feature. And this is something that we want to pay really close attention to. Although there are going to be other classes within bourgeois society, for reasons that Marx and Engels are going to show us, most of these classes cease to matter. What really ends up mattering is the conflict between the bourgeoisie on the one hand and the workers or the proletariat on the other hand, the interaction between them in society. Because these other classes are going to, you might say, fall out of the picture, or they're not going to be part of the ongoing important developments that are taking place. Now, one of the things that oftentimes students coming to this text for the first time don't realize, because we're looking at it from the vantage point of the present, is when we hear the word bourgeois, if we have any associations with that, we often tend to think of people who are kind of, boring, who are focused on making money, who are just, going along the career path that they're supposed to go along. We think of people who are conservative. And Marx will agree with that to a certain extent. But the bourgeoisie was not originally conservative. They were the most radical, the most revolutionary class. They're the ones who transformed society to bring it out of the feudal era and into the modern era, along with its means of productions, its property relations, its understanding of the human being, and its understanding of society. So the first part of this story, we're looking at how the bourgeoisie revolutionized things. So how did that happen? He says, well, the feudal industry, the feudal system of industry, you always have to have some way of producing basic goods. And some of that could be, a matter of land and agriculture, but there was also some, what we call manufacturing going on in ancient society and in feudal society. If you're making swords, for example, or plowshares, you need a smith who's actually hammering out iron. That iron had to come from ore, which somebody had to smelt, and there's probably a whole bunch of other processes along the way. Just to store your grain, you might need barrels. Well, there was a person who did that, a cooper, a barrel maker. And we can think of all sorts of other professions that fit in there as well, which had a more or less elevated status, but were not the ones who were really in charge in medieval society. Doctors, for example. Medicine was rather primitive in the Middle Ages, but there were doctors, and you could hire one. They might kill you, but you could get one to help you if you were sick. The clergy could be understood to fit in there as well, although they overlapped to a certain degree with the nobility when we're talking about bishops or abbots or people like that. Now, what happens, he says, the feudal system of industry, in which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new market. So originally, production is being carried out by these guilds. And the guilds, we still have this today to a certain extent in certain of our manual trades, where we have apprentices, journeymen, and masters. Now, back in the old days, apprentices were sort of the lowest of the low, and journeymen were, one step up. The masters were the ones who really ran the show, and they'd been in it for a long time. They'd learned their craft. They exercised power over the journeymen and the apprentices. Nowadays, if somebody is a union apprentice, they're probably actually making pretty good money, but that's because of the transformation of that. In any case, a lot of the manufacturing that was taking place in the Middle Ages was happening in towns, and it was happening on the part of these guilds, and it wasn't able to, that system was not able to provide the goods that were being demanded by expanded markets. Why were the markets expanding? Well, he gives you some examples of factors that played into that. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape of Africa. They opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie, the people who could manufacture things and sell things to them. Those who engaged in commerce have been part of the bourgeoisie. And the colonization of America created new markets as well, the East Indian and Chinese markets, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities general gave the spurs these developments in navigation and industry. So what's going to happen? From the guild process, we're going to get a different process of production. One that we call manufacturing. Now, manufacture comes from the word for hand, manus in Latin. And manufacture literally means what the hand is doing. So if I'm, whittling a piece of chalk and making, I don't know, maybe I sculpt this into a beautiful object like the Eiffel Tower if I actually had talent for that sort of thing, I've engaged in some manufacturing. That's not going to be that important unless I can do this over and over and over again and sell these things to other people, and maybe have somebody else who buys them from me and then sells them to somebody else at a distance. Manufacture is different because now it's no longer these closed guilds, it's the burghers, the bourgeois, the town people from the burgs who are manufacturing things. They're hiring other people to do this work, they're selling the produce, and they're able to supply a much larger market thereby. So the needs of people are actually being met in this transformation. And at first, feudal society is able to go along and act as if things are just, just the way they were, we just have some better manufacturing. But what's going to happen is the bourgeoisie are going to rise to power. Why? Because they're going to become wealthy. They're going to acquire power within society. They're going to be unhappy at the sort of conditions that the nobles are, or the aristocracy, depending on what kind of country we have, and all these other, professions, are imposing upon them. This is this age-old conflict between rank and wealth, how those two square off against each other. So this process keeps on going. He says, the markets keep growing, the demand ever rising. Even at a certain point, manufacturing no longer suffices, making things by hand. So what happens then? How do we get to the industrial age? It's through the harnessing of non-human power to increase the capacity for human beings by taking what we call machines that extract energy from other sources. It could be from human beings running on a wheel or something like that, turning a crank, but it could also be the harnessing of fuels. And that's going to happen. Machines are going to make it much more efficient for human beings to be involved in the process of production, which is now no longer manufacturing, but rather machine production. It says, modern industry takes the place of manufacture, the place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of industrial armies, the modern bourgeoisie. So what does this lead to? Several other developments go along with this. The development of an entire world market that we're going to talk about in a moment. So he says, the modern bourgeoisie is actually the product of a long course of development, of revolutions. It's a revolutionary class in the modes of production and exchange. Now, here's where Marx and Engels say something really important. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie is accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. So, in earlier society, there were people who were higher up than the manufacturers, but they're actually, I'm going to erase this, going to decline in status as things go on. So are the professionals. They're also going to decline in status. So he talks about the bourgeoisie putting an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn aside the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, that led to a recognition of nobility and the sort of privileges that went with it, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man other than naked self-interest, other than callous cash payment. So this becomes a time of what we can call economic humans. People always want to say economic man, but I prefer economic humans because it's also going to affect the condition of women just as much as well. Everything gets evaluated in terms of economic exchange. What can you sell things for? What can you buy things for? What's the cash value of things? The bourgeoisie are the ones who come to dominate through the processes that develop and exchange wealth. So he says, we have egotistical calculation. It resolves personal worth into exchange value. And in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, the legal system over here and the freedoms that went with it was kind of complicated. Over here, the one freedom that we're focused on is that of free trade. Now he says something else that's really interesting. The bourgeoisie stripped of its halo every occupation that was honored and looked up to with awe. So what would these include? The physician, the doctor, the lawyer, the person who handles the legal matters, the priest, the poet, the man of science. They all become, these professional classes, become wage laborers. They work for the bourgeoisie. They work for those who have property, those who own the means of production. So, you know, if you could think about the condition of education of professors in our own time as well, and the discussion about the, you know, adjunct work that goes on. Now this ends up changing things radically. He says, the bourgeoisie revolutionizes the instruments of production, thereby the relations of production, with them whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production, what it was that people over here wanted to do in unaltered form, was the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. So as the bourgeoisie engages in this constant retooling, revamping things, we see developments happen. So somebody who's a bourgeois, you know, in a bourgeois family and establishes a company, a viable business in 1748, by the time that 1848 rolls around, they may be out of business because other people have come after them and found a better way to do things, what we call business models or market models. And this process introduces a lot of instability. Instability that ends up essentially wiping away this old society and replacing it with a very new society. When we talk about globalization, is a key word these days, Marx is one of the first people to really talk about how that happens due to the bourgeoisie. He says they've given the world market a cosmopolitan character to production and to consumption in every country. So because capitalism, and we'll talk about what capitalism means in a bit, because capitalism and bourgeois modes of production triumph, they end up imposing themselves all over the world, and the world does become a smaller but also a more similar place because of that. He says, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, the immensely facilitated means of communication, they draw all the other peoples into the realm of civilization. But it's not civilization like this, it's civilization like this. He says, it compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves. So cultures that are still in a feudal sort of mode, when they're confronted by this, the people who are on top at least, or who have some degree of freedom, are confronted with an option. Try to stick with the old thing, but then you're going to be replaced. You're going to fall into these lower parts of society. Or join the bourgeoisie. Do things like them. Start wearing a jacket and tie. This, by the way, is what has been called by some people the uniform of the bourgeoisie. You know, wearing a tie, wearing a jacket. We don't often associate it with that these days, you know, because we tend to, be a little bit more informal, except for, special occasions, so a jacket and shirt or something like that. But this was part of the costume of the bourgeoisie, and it became something. It became a sign that you could see spreading worldwide. So, what else is occurring? He says the bourgeoisie has called into existence the men who are going to end up replacing the bourgeoisie eventually, but who are going to get into the greatest conflict with the bourgeoisie, the proletariat. And I'm going to do a little bit of erasure here in a moment because we need to talk about the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But I want to talk about this term, proletariat, for a moment. Marx didn't originally mean all people who work as the proletariat. He meant those who were involved in industrial production, primarily in the cities. So he wasn't including, necessarily peasants among the proletariat. It doesn't mean everybody who's lacking property whatsoever either, the lower class, because he excludes what he calls the rotten dregs of society, the lumpen proletariat, the rag proletariat, meaning the criminals. Not all of them fit into that. There's other classes as well, like the petty bourgeoisie, the little shopkeepers and people along those lines who are going to eventually find their way either into the proletariat or doing something else. And the professional classes are always just one step away from becoming the proletariat. The word proletariat is a Latin word originally. And it meant those who could only contribute one kind of thing. Prole, children. They had no property. They had nothing going for them except for their capacity to reproduce. Now, in modern industrial society, the proletariat have one thing going for them: their ability to work, their ability to supply labor. So they are the labor force in modern industrial society.